All right, everyone. I'm Deidre Berzer, and I'm the director of the South Dakota Historical Society Press. And this is History Talks, which is a monthly virtual author speaker series that generally highlights one of our books. Sometimes it's a book that's just about South Dakota that's not from us, but today we definitely have one of our books that we could not be more proud of being the publisher of, and what a treat tonight. So this is a program of the press and also of the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation, and we do this together. And we hope that now that you found us, if you have not been on our program before, that you will come back every month, because every month is really fascinating. And if you now want to know what you've missed, you can go back and see these programs. They're available on the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation's YouTube channel, and we'll tell you more about that at the very end. Okay, so tonight we have our brand new Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction. It was just released on May 30th, and its editor, Nancy Tystad Koupal, who is the director and editor-in-chief of the Pioneer Girl Project. And that means that she has been the mastermind behind all of the Pioneer Girl books and the editor of Pioneer Girl Perspectives and Pioneer Girl Revised Texts, and now Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction. She's also the editor of Our Landlady, which is a compilation of L. Frank Baum's satirical essays. And she has a master's degree in English from Morehead State in Kentucky, and did graduate work in American literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it is my great honor to be following in her footsteps as the director of the press she founded in 1997, the South Dakota Historical Society Press. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Nancy, and I do want to ask you all to make sure you're muted. And also, we have a lot of people signed up for this event. So what we're going to do is, when we have question and answer time, I'm going to ask that you write your question out in the chat. And so the chat is on the bar. It could either be on the top or the bottom of your screen, and it'll say chat, and you can just click on that and it'll pull down, and I will read those questions and moderate them and pass them along to Nancy. So I hope you all have lots of questions. All right. So Nancy, thank you so much for giving us your time and being here to tell us about Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction, and Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rosewater Lane on the path into fiction.
Thank you. I've had a tendency to kind of quaver in and out here tonight. So if I'll try and keep aware of whether or not I'm on screen or not. But meanwhile, I have some prepared remarks, and then I'm excited to know what your questions might be. So let me get started. In the summer of 1930, Rose Wilder Lane's literary agent informed her that he could not sell Pioneer Girl, Laura Ingalls Wilder's memoir of her first 18 years. But Lane was not going to accept that verdict. She talked to Wilder about the possibility of turning the story into fiction. But Wilder, who was a newspaper columnist, not a novelist, was not interested. So, without her mother's knowledge or permission, Lane quietly turned the Wisconsin chapter of Wilder's life story into what she thought would be a picture book for young readers. And there the matter stood until February 1931, when Laura Ingalls Wilder found a surprise in her rural Missouri mailbox, a letter from New York publisher Alfred A. Knopf. Opening the letter, Wilder discovered that editor Marion Fieri of the children's department at Knopf had very much enjoyed her manuscript when Grandma was a little girl and wanted her to expand it by 15,000 words. This must have come as something of a shock to Wilder, who had no idea what the editor was talking about. But she could guess. It surely had something to do with her adult autobiography, Pioneer Girl, which Lane had then edited a total of 3 times and was herself taking around by hand to New York magazine publishers in the city. As vaguely as she could, Wilder wrote Fiery that she had, quote, many more memories of the days of my story, and am sure I can make it the length you wish. And then she waited for the next shoe to drop. What was her daughter up to? Next slide, please. The contrast between these two remarkably different women, Wilder and Lane, a mother and a daughter, a rural newspaper columnist and a nationally established novelist, an author and her editor. It provides the drama in Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction. Deidre, there we go. There's Wilder, and there's a issue of the Missouri Ruralist for which she provided a weekly column. So it is these two women and their strong personalities, their different experiences that provide the drama in Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction. About a week after Wilder heard from Fieri, a long letter from Lane finally arrived in Wilder's mailbox. Next slide, please. Lane painstakingly explained that she had run a portion of Pioneer Girl through her own typewriter. Next slide, please. Her euphemism, this was Lane's euphemism for editing. She had run it through her typewriter and polished it up one last time, creating a picture book that, quote, strung together the stories of Wilder's father, Charles P. Ingalls. She did not explain when or why she'd done this, but simply directed her mother to a carbon copy of When Grandma Was a Little Girl in the file cabinet of the sleeping porch of Rocky Ridge Farm. Hoping to avoid conflict over the liberties she had taken, Lane wrote, I wish you would just get another tablet and put down in it somehow the other 15,000 words that Marion wants. When I come home, we'll go through the whole thing and we will send it off to her. Then that will be off our minds. But unfortunately, Lane could not leave it at that. She also had to tell her mother not only how to structure the narrative, but how to shape her characters, pushing her mother further and further into the world of fiction. It was at that point that Wilder began to push back. Next slide. In Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction, the story of these two strong individuals plays out through the manuscripts that each woman generated. Lane's 2 picture book typescripts, the rough Pioneer Girl, the rough juvenile Pioneer Girl, and the cleaned up and polished When Grandma Was a Little Girl, illustrate the ways in which Lane, the experienced novelist, began to edit and rearrange her mother's autobiographical writings into a more compelling fictional story for young readers. She likely judged that the youthful nature of Wilder's autobiography, the fact that it focused solely on Wilder's first 18 years of life, made it most suitable for children. And she selected the cozy Wisconsin log cabin that Wilder had so lovingly described in her autobiography as the setting. Laura was then 4 years old, and the Ingalls family had just moved back to Wisconsin after their time in Kansas. To make it picture book length, Lane had trimmed it to about 8,000 words, removing many elements from the story, including baby Carrie and the sibling rivalry between sisters Mary and Laura. Next slide. Lane then polished the story, titling it When Grandma Was a Little Girl, and she sent it to her literary agent, who rejected it out of hand. She next sent it to her friends, illustrators Berta and Elmer Hayter, who submitted it to Marion Fieri at Knopf. In condensing the story, Lane informed her mother she had eliminated a lot of material that Wilder would now have to put back in to increase the word count. At the same time, however, Lane had overstepped. She gave Wilder's ma and pa new dialogue and new characterizations that Wilder could not let stand. Next slide. Retrieving the carbon from Laura's files, Wilder immediately took her daughter to task. Quote, "You have Ma say she vowed she didn't believe those young ones were ever going to sleep," Wilder scolded Lane. "Never in the world was that what she would have said." The author then reframed the dialect to reflect her mother's voice and character. "Charles, I don't believe those children will ever go to sleep," is what Caroline Quiner Ingalls would have said and did, Wilder explained. "Neither Ma nor Pa," Wilder continued, "would have thought of calling us young ones. We were always children, and I vow was something Ma never would have said, being a lady and a school teacher." Next slide. Wilder made these changes to her character's speech and behavior in her completed manuscript, which is abbreviated as WCM. And this wording is very close to how it appears in Little House in the Big Woods. If you look at the lines from the various manuscripts side by side, you can see how fluid the editing is until the book is finally in print. Lane inserted the line in grandma. Wilder first corrected it and then polished it in her completed manuscript to include the idea of the children not sleeping until Pa played them to them. Also interesting are the changes that occur in the second line over time. First, Lane has Pa taking down the fiddle. Then Wilder has him taking it up until the two women settle on, quote, "Pa got his fiddle" in the final version. Next slide. In her February letter, Lane also tried to convince her mother that Charlie Quiner's naughtiness in the harvest field, readers will remember Charlie and his brush with the yellow jackets. That was something that Laura would have admired, Lane argued. Wilder wisely ignored her. Unfortunately, only one page of Wilder's critique of the Grandma manuscript survives, and that fragment has long been misfiled within Wilder's correspondence concerning On the Banks of Plum Creek. Wilder's response to Lane's letter, if any, does not survive, so we don't know exactly how the author responded to her editor's suggestions to alter the reactions of her main protagonist, but we can infer by her response by looking at her surviving manuscripts. Next slide. In working drafts and fragmentary episodes, Wilder added 15 to 20,000 words to the picture book manuscript, turning it into a chapter book for readers aged 8 to 10. She took control of her characters, reinstated the sibling rivalry between Laura and Mary, showcased her own tomboyishness, and returned her baby sister Carrie to the narrative. She also created new material, blending her memories with the needs of the story. For example, Wilder combined her reminiscences of playing house in Wisconsin as a 4-year-old with household jobs she actually performed as a teenager in Dakota Territory. In her completed manuscript, she outlined the work in a familiar rhyme that specified a job for each day. She returned Charlie Quiner's misbehavior to the story, but without a shred of admiration for his conduct. Next slide. As Wilder sorted through her own memories of Wisconsin to fill out the time when she was 4 and 5 years old, she also relied on the memories of her mother's sister, Martha Quiner Carpenter. After Caroline Quiner Ingalls' death in 1924, Wilder had written her Aunt Martha asking her to write down everything she could remember about the Quiner sisters' lives in Wisconsin. She was frank about what she wanted the information for, so that she and Lane could use it in their writing. Carpenter obliged her with at least 2 lengthy letters in which she remembered all-night sugaring off parties, braiding hats, the howling of wolves, and the screams of panthers. Next slide. Carpenter also referred to what Wilder would later call the glamour of the woods. In spite of wolves and wildcats, Aunt Martha wrote, we were glad to get out in the woods. It was beautiful to be out there with birds and other small animals of the forest, and to hear the music of the wilds with the beauty of all the rest of the landscape. It would carry you away, and you would forget yourself and rejoice that you were there to see and have it all. These same sentiments underlie Pa's experiences in the final chapter of Big Woods, when he fails to shoot a deer and a bear while hunting because, quote, I was so much interested in watching them, and the woods were so peaceful in the moonlight that I forgot all about my gun until the bear was waddling away into the woods. Next slide. Using her own memories, her father's stories, and her Aunt Martha's recollections, Wilder expanded her narrative, employing a deft hand with dialogue and a sure sense of who her characters were. Throughout March and April of 1931, she relied heavily on Lane's editorial guidance as she wrote and rewrote her story perhaps a dozen times, estimated Lane, who was back living on the Wilders' Missouri farm at the time. I'd cross out great chunks, Lane recalled, of reading her mother's drafts, telling her the style was dull. She needed more vividness, more color and contrast, that the whole thing should be done as she'd done this bit and that bit, so she'd do it all over again. Lane's recollection is dismissive and self-serving, but Wilder's willingness to learn how to craft a novel comes through clearly. Even though she resisted her daughter's suggestions when they did not serve the story, Wilder valued her daughter's experience, trusted her editorial judgment in most things, and knew there was still much for her to learn about writing fiction for young readers. Next slide. When Little House in the Big Woods debuted in April 1932 as a children's book club selection among a fanfare of rave reviews, Wilder also recognized her own strengths as a writer. She had never lost faith in the compelling story of her own childhood or the lure of her father's stories about it. She had ensured the integrity of her characters as she understood them. While she would continue to accept her daughter's editing on her behalf in years to come, she would also rely on her own sure instincts as a writer of her own life story. In short, she would become adept at writing autobiographical fiction, as she distilled 6 more novels from her original handwritten autobiography. In 1949, 7 years after Wilder wrote and Harper and Brothers published the last Little House novel, children's literary critic Elizabeth Ryder Montgomery summed up her success this way, quote, this series of true stories about real people is one of the most popular with boys and girls ever written, because each book is a good story, absorbing from the first page to the last, with characters who become well-loved friends. Next slide. A 9-year-old reader from Tipton, Iowa, put it even more succinctly, saying of Little House in the Big Woods, I wish it would never come to an end, for it was so good. Over the last 14 years, the Pioneer Girl Project in the South Dakota Historical Society Press have been studying the texts on which Wilder's Little House series is based. We have explored the ways in which Lane attempted to make her mother's story publishable and looked closely at how the women worked together as mother and daughter, country journalist, and established novelist, editor, and author. To transform Wilder's matter-of-fact autobiography into compelling children's fiction. Next slide. The press documents this process in 4 books, beginning with publication of Wilder's handwritten draft of her life story in Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, which came out in 2014. This best-selling volume not only published the original manuscript, it also annotated the material, exploring its relationship to both Wilder's life and the history it recorded. We followed that up with a book of essays about how the publication of the autobiography fed into Wilder's scholarship. Appearing in 1917, Pioneer Girl Perspectives, Exploring Laura Ingalls Wilder, showcases the observations of 10 Wilder scholars, including Noel Silverman, the longtime counsel of the Little House Heritage Trust. Next slide. 4 years later, in 2021, the press published its massive study of the 3 versions of Wilder's autobiography that Lane had edited during the spring and summer of 1930. Pioneer Girl, the revised text, took deep dives into the ways in which Wilder and Lane worked together and how that affected all of Wilder's Little House novels. In brief essays, the editor supplied historical context for each of the geographical settings of Wilder's memoir. The result is a literary casebook for anyone who wishes to study the backstory of all the Little House novels. Finally, Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction, which was released at the end of May 2023, collects all the existing manuscript material that leads directly from Pioneer Girl to Little House in the Big Woods and examines
I'm afraid we've lost Nancy. She'll probably pop back in. So everyone hold on for a moment. And we'll see if she calls us back. She's having a few difficulties with her internet connection, apparently. So you get to look at the beautiful, yay, she's back.
Sorry, I almost made it through, but anyhow. So The Path into Fiction focuses on Wilder's just her first novel. And in doing so, it charts the path these 2 remarkable women took to craft Little House in the Big Woods and all the help they received along the way. As an editor for over 45 years, I want to point out that the most recent book, especially, celebrates and values the role of editors. Editors are not co-authors. They are skillful craftsmen who understand language and pacing. They can hear the poetry of each writer's own rhythm and help to make each author's story sing in its own way. When talented, they can analyze episodes, shift material from weak to strong positions, and help authors strengthen their own voices and stories. Lane's editorial work on her mother's manuscripts was nothing short of brilliant, just as her mother's understanding of her own story was profound. As Wilder's experience as a fiction writer grew, her storytelling grew stronger with each book. And as she began to understand the role of fiction in her story, the way in which it could speak truth beyond and outside of fact, Wilder's writing became even stronger. But wisely, Wilder never outgrew her editor and continued to rely on Lane for the polish that editors provide, for the sure advice about which episodes to omit, what episodes to combine, and how to craft effective openings and transition. But Wilder was always the author, Lane the editor, and together they created classics of American literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So many kernels of wisdom there. And I just love hearing you talk about your passion in these books. So audience, please go to the chat and type your questions. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can get to the chat. And you all may want to, if you don't want to see everybody's picture and feel like you're in the Brady Bunch times 10, literally, you can go to your view button and hit speaker view if you want to do that. And then it'll mostly be on Nancy. And I'm going to pull up the chat and see what we have here. If I can get it to go. All right. Okay. So this is like a business question. Will this be available to watch later? Yes. But you have to give us some time to create it. So a couple months generally before we can get these videos crafted, because we have to take out extra the chit chat.
They have to take out my feeding in and out.
Yes, and that is the job of Catherine Force. She's the CEO of our South Dakota Historical Society Foundation, does an excellent job with these, and it will end up on the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation YouTube channel, and you can get there through their website, which is sdhsf.org. All right, and then Trundle Bud Tails, aka Sarah Utoff, is saying to us that she's so happy to see friendly faces, and I can see her smiling at me. So, okay, so questions. Hopefully, I'm not missing any, because sometimes they don't. Oh, okay, it tells me I have new messages, but where are they? Sometimes I have to fight with Zoom.
Oh.
Oh, can you send the link for the recording? Oh, are there any more planned books?
Now that's a good question. Deidre and I have been talking about that, and we would certainly like to carry on going from here to Farmer Boy, because there's lots of stories with Farmer Boy, but we're still in the talking stages of that one. Myself, I'm very interested in doing an article on Wilder's first 4 years, the history of that manuscript, when it was written, why it was written, why and how it was published in the way it was published. So that's probably what I will work on this summer after I start to get bored with nothing to do.
Is that possible? Does that happen?
Well,
Okay.
I'm told it does. So, yeah.
So Lucy Beard would like to know if the family made a lot of money from the books, and how did it impact the family?
Yeah, they did. That not right in the beginning, because it was a cumulative thing. The Lane had a problem with children's books, in part because they didn't. The price tag on them was pretty small. So 10% of $2 isn't going to add up very fast. So it frankly took a number of years and a number of books before the money started to come in. But by the time by the 1940s, by the end of the book, the end of the series, they were making a nice income from Wilder. She was no longer dependent. She and her husband were no longer dependent on their daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, on whom they'd been dependent for a long time. And in fact, before the end of Lane's lifetime, that would reverse, and Lane would become far more dependent on her mother's earned royalties income.
Right. Okay. So we have a comment and then a question. A comment from Tara Miller saying, I was always amazed at how Laura basically had to be talked into writing the books.
Oh, well, yeah, I suppose there's some truth in that. I mean, I think Wilder was very interested from the very beginning in writing about her life story. She really thought she'd lived an interesting life on the frontiers of America. That it's that first 18 years of her life that she thinks is really the interesting part of it. And she, I think, began writing that up quite early, back in the teens. But it was, I think it kind of had fallen by the wayside by the 1930s when she was retired and had not committed the story to paper. And I think at that point, Lane did provide the impetus that got the material on paper. But I think for carrying it on year after year, Lane probably could see the bigger picture of the entire series, where it was harder for Wilder to recognize that she needed to give her readers what they wanted, which was the whole story. But she's very conscious that her readers want more from her all the time.
Plus, they told her that. Right?
Yeah, they
And
told
lots
her.
of letters. So Juliet wants to know, what experience, if any, did Wilder and Lane have in writing children's stories prior to when Grandma was a little girl?
Well, from what I can tell, well, the one experience that Lane had was that she wrote children's stories, essentially, or it would be more proper to say they were stories about children for the Red Cross, Junior Red Cross News. She'd also written some poetry that was, as Bill Anderson always tells me, very bad poetry. But they had, I suppose you could say, sort of dabbled around the edges of writing fiction. Not Wilder, but Lane had also seen the success that, of course, the Hatters had in writing fiction for children. And I really think Lane just saw no limits to her own abilities. She felt that if she decided she was going to do fiction, she would do fiction and she would do it well. And now she never actually turned her own hand to fiction. She only turned her hand to editing her mother's fiction.
All right, we have a question from Eileen. Did the Depression affect the sales of the books?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know that I can really answer it. I think the Depression, the publishers felt that people were not buying their books, and so what the effect that you see on Wilder in particular is that for her second book, Farmer Boy, they were just too worried about its marketability to give her the same royalty terms that she'd had on her first book. So you can see that is affecting her income.
All right, now we have two questions about Almanzo. Did he support Laura's writing, and is there any record of his opinion of the books or of the collaboration between Laura and Rose going on around him?
Well, I don't think I've ever heard him or seen anything where he commented on the books, but he was very willing, especially when Lane asked, to provide information about his own past, about his life as a farmer, as and his activities in Dakota Territory. There's a long questionnaire that he wrote out and answered for Lane when she was writing Freeland, her book about Dakota Territory and the Dakota boom. There's also a series of letters that he wrote, I think in the 30s, 37 or 38, where once again, Lane was asking him questions, and he's very willing to answer. But after a certain point, he would just say, Well, Bessie will finish this. It was just as if there was a limit to how much he was gonna write down. He was not a writer.
Yes, some of his terse answers to some of those questions I find very funny.
Well, and but he was really good. I mean, you have to admit, I mean, they pestered him about all kinds
I'm
of,
sure.
and he was very good. He'd even draw pictures to explain the difference between sleighs, for example, or how certain things worked. I think he was a very willing collaborator, as it were.
That's great. Okay, Alan Brose would like to know if Laura's books were reviewed nationally and how were they received by the critics?
They were.
Maybe versus the readers. Is there a difference between how they were received by critics versus readers?
I don't. I can't answer that question. I don't believe there was. They were reviewed nationally. The first one had reviews all across the country. Was reviewed in all the major New York City newspapers. The critics were just very favorable of it. By the time her third book came out, which was Little House on the Prairie, Kirkus Reviews, or the Kirkus Library Service of Reviews, had begun, and she got favorable reviews in that. So I don't see a lot of difference between, I think probably as then as now, sometimes the reviews are far more intellectual or esoteric than a reader's response, which I tried to get at that a little bit in the book by quoting the New York Herald review, I think it was, at some length, which was all about how Little House in the Big Woods took readers back in time to a time of simplicity, and that made their time look tawdry, I suppose you'd say. So there's this sort of intellectual component, whereas you have readers like the young girl from Tipton, Iowa, who said it out. I didn't want it to end. That's how readers generally responded, in my experience.
And this is a great question from Amy about you, Nancy. How, well, actually, I'll just read what she says. Could you please tell us about your own history, Nancy, with the LIW series? Did you read the books when you were a child?
I did. I started reading them in the 5th grade when my teacher read the Long Winter out loud in front of the class, and it was magic. So I immediately, being a bookworm, went to the Carnegie Library downtown and got all the books and read them straight through. And, I loved them. They spoke to me, I suppose, on a lot of levels. Little House in the Big Woods is simply, it reads like a recipe for how to survive on your own, how to make cheese, how to make hats, how to make, how to hunt for a living. That really appealed to me, beginning in the 5th grade and all the way till this final reading of it now. So
did you read The Long Winter first, and then you went back to the beginning of the series? We do have one question about the order, and if the order in which she wrote the books is the way to go.
Well, I believe, not having read them that way myself, I don't know that I can prescribe, but I think I know myself now, if I were to go approach them now, I would start at the beginning. And the beginning is Little House in the Big Woods. and move through to the end.
And if we're talking about reading the books in order, and you mentioned your interest in doing something with the first 4 years, we think that was earlier than the end, and of course it's always tacked on at the end because it's chronologically. Would you say don't read that one at all, depending on what age you are?
Well, that's a good question. I remember when I first read it. It was in college when it came out, and I was so excited, and I got it at the college bookstore the first opportunity I could, and I just was hugely disappointed because it was just not what I expected Laura Ingalls Wilder's books to be like. I think that it was, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons, of course, is that she was trying to write for adults in that book. She was not trying to write for children. Now, that doesn't excuse it, but it changes the tone. I also think it's very unfortunate that HarperCollins didn't do some editing on that book. All the other books had been edited, and everybody knew that. Well, yeah, I'm sure everybody knew that. And to not touch that book, to leave it as if it were an artifact, just really was not the right way to go, in my opinion.
Right. Let's see. There's a conversation about, is anything being done to reverse the American Library Association's stripping of Wilder's name from the book award? Sarah Utoff jumped in a little bit with the award that the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum has started in Mansfield that they awarded to Bill Anderson this year. So I'm just throwing that out in case you might have a bit of commentary about that.
I don't know anything about reversals on that. I think that was an unfortunate choice because in some ways it had more to do about our history than it had to do about Wilder and her take on our history. So
I think that's a good way to think about it. All right, now we have a couple of questions about photos and illustrations. So we have a request for the Ma and Pa photo story.
Oh man. That's getting to be an old story these days, but back in the days when I first started working for the State Historical Society, which was, let's see, I started working for the State Historical Society in 1979. So that gives you a good clue about how old I really am. And at that point in time, nobody knew where the charcoal enhanced portraits of Ma and Pa are. Nobody knew where they were. They had been given to the Historical Society, but the Historical Society didn't recognize that they had them. And I was simply going through an oversized file because I was the journal editor. I had to provide photographs for all the articles that we published. And I was going through these big matte, flat cases of photographs that for the most part were unrecognized. They were not unidentified. And I was looking for something totally different. And all of a sudden I looked at these two photographs, or these two they're oversized photographs, and said, my God, that's Ma and Pa. And that's exactly who it was. But the labels, in those days, they used to stick labels on that you licked and you put them on. You wrote on them first, or you typed on them, but then you licked them and you put them on. And as age comes to us all and to all things, the glue evaporated, labels fell off, and suddenly nobody knew what any of those photographs referred to, except people like me who might come along and say, oh, I know those people. So it was sort of a chance thing, but now we know who they are, and they're all thoroughly identified everywhere, and the pictures are, out for the public to use. So it ended up being a good story.
That's a great serendipitous moment.
Mhm.
So let's see. Lucy Beard would like to know how the illustration process worked. And she says, were they involved with the illustrator? I think she means Laura and Rose by they.
Not really. And that's still true to a large extent today. The publisher works with the illustrator and the author as separate entities. So the publisher hired the illustrator, but they asked Wilder for photographic material. So Wilder sent them photographs. We know for sure she sent them the daguerreotype, what she called a daguerreotype of her ma and pa, probably their wedding picture. She sent that to HarperCollins.
That's great. Thank you. Super.
You don't need it.
We need some of you need to mute so we can hear Nancy tell us the story. Nelson, maybe you could do that. That would be great. Okay, thank you.
So anyhow, that's how that process worked. And what it happened when Garth Williams illustrated the books, he went directly. He was secured. His services were secured by the publisher, but he went directly to all the sites, and he went to the Wilders, looked through all their photographic material, and so he had a far better connection with the material than Helen Sewell, the original illustrator, did. Just a difference in time, in part.
So I want to throw in about Garth Williams that the Wilder Memorial Society in DeSmet has a Garth Williams exhibit they will be putting on this summer. I don't know if it's up yet, but I know it'll definitely be up in July in conjunction with the pageant. And I think it's the second weekend of the pageant, maybe right in the middle of July. Bill Anderson will be there. Nancy, are you going to be there?
No. Not on purpose.
No, not on purpose. Okay. Bill's going to be there. Maybe Judy Thompson. I'm trying to remember who I've spoken with.
It's Bill Anderson, Judy Thompson, and yes. Cindy Wilson.
Yes. So Judy is the artist of the covers of our books. If you don't recognize her name, that's who she is. Yes. So head to DeSmet. It's the middle of July. Get your lodging now. It may already be too late.
So one thing I would just like to add, that usually people ask, well, what about this book were you surprised by? What did you find out doing in this book that surprised you? And I think that one of the things that I really found intriguing about working with these manuscripts in particular was the fact that Wilder wrote more episodes in some ways than were used. Lane said no to a number of episodes that Wilder wrote for this book. One was a story about an American Indian, kind of an American Indian hero story about a boy who saved the family by riding a big fish across, not the family, but the whole nation, by riding a big fish across the Lake Pepin. And there were just things that it surprised me that some of these things didn't make it into the book. But it was good to see, Wilder wrote an episode about her mother that really was more about herself. She wrote this, her mother climbs into the pig pen and saves the baby pigs from their mother. And when she gets out of the pig pen, Charles Ingalls comes over and berates her for this, and the mother essentially says, "Well, it didn't. Nothing bad happened, so it's all good." Well, that's an attitude that Wilder would portray, and not one that Caroline Ingalls, as Wilder had shaped her. By this time, Wilder has shaped her into this civilizer, this woman who is docile. She's very much in her father, in her husband. She bows to her husband. So Wilder has shaped this image of her, whereas she will shape her own image as far more defiant in the marital relationship. So that's one instance that I can point to, and probably almost the only one, in which Lane says, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work for the creator you've created, and eliminates that episode. So those are some of the things that's really been fun for me to look at and see. And it's new, it's all new material.
So Nancy, there's a question about where you're going to be speaking in the next few months. And that reminds me that I should put in a plug for Nancy. Will be doing a book release party and book signing at the High Plains Western Heritage Center in Spearfish a week from today. So on June 22nd at 1:30 p.m. That's Mountain Time. And it's also a book release party for our new biography of Sacagawea, which is written by Candy Moulton, and that just showed up in the warehouse today. So, and that's our history talks for July. On July 13th at 7 p.m. Central, Candy Moulton will be talking about Sacagawea. So let's see. I think we can take maybe a couple more questions here. And I hope you caught that Nancy just said all new material, a lot of new material. And there's my beautiful copy that Nancy has signed, which I'm sure many of you already have it, but if you don't and you're wondering where you can purchase it, you can buy it from us online, sdhspress.com, or from the foundation and their online store. And they also have it in their store that's in the Capitol, in the basement of the Capitol. Lots of places to get. Pioneer Girl, The Path into Fiction. And let's see, we've got a comment here from Alan. And he says he likes about the books that are set in De Smet is the description of the development of the territory during the Dakota boom, at the same time when his own ancestors were arriving and settling in Hutchinson County, south of Mitchell. And that's a great, the connections, people in South Dakota. I run into people all the time who have those kind of direct connections to the Ingalls. I'm sure, Nancy, you've had many people tell you stories along those lines.
Yeah, yes, I have. I've had Ingalls relations come up to me and say, that they're related to the Ingalls. And I think, like any South Dakotan or any native-born South Dakotan, my father's family homesteaded in the Howard area, which is very close to De Smet. And my mother's family homesteaded in the Ethan Dimmock Parkston area. So that's what helps to make those books so special. They're a part of my history. That's why they resonate like they do. So. Yes,
and also there's so many universal aspects to them as well. So they appeal to people on that local level where connecting relatives, friends, neighbors, but also on a universal level because the themes just resonate with us so much. No matter what stage you are in life. I read them as a child. I read them over many, many times, taught semester-long courses in which we read every single one. Someone was saying in the chat earlier, so if you're interested in the order to read, she does not advocate going straight forward through them. And I'm sure we could probably have quite the article about that and what order to read them from. And we've got a lot of links that are showing up in the chat. So if you're not a member of the South Dakota State Historical Society, we support this kind of historical projects like the books, but also these very things we're talking about with South Dakota early settlers and ancestors on the present. So if we would love your help in helping us preserve South Dakota stories. And I think a lot of the other discussion here is about where to get the books. Yes, and we do have them on hand in our office, as Carol was asking. And we get them sent out, but once they leave our office, they're in the hands of the post office. All bets are off. So, and then we have a question here. Does the Historical Society Press have any plans or desire to publish a biography of Rose Wilder Lane? We do have, actually, we have a book coming out next year in 2024 that is Rose Wilder Lane's columns that she wrote for the Pittsburgh Courier. And the columns were called Rose Lane Says, and that was from 1941 to a couple of years, 44, 45, early 45. Yes. So it's not a biography, but it's getting a lot of primary source material that really hasn't been readily available that Rose wrote, and really different stuff than we've seen from her in the 30s. She goes in a different direction.
Well, as a former director, I can say yes, we would be very interested, or that I was always, and I'm sure Deidre is too, interested in a biography of Rose Wilder Lane. I would also like to see, frankly, maybe a collective biography of the three Ingalls sisters that are not I don't think you could write a full story about Mary or a full biography about Mary, Grace, and Carrie, but I think you could write a collective biography that would be very interesting. That's what I think. And I don't know why, and no one has really pitched a biography of Rose Wilder Lane. I don't understand that completely.
We do know there are a few people with some things in the works, and we'll just leave it there. Yeah. And people are loving that idea of the collective biography of the Ingalls girls. So, all right, we're coming up on an hour. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Nancy? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Well,
you know what? I left off with, I was talking about DeSmet, and I left off on your thing next week. And someone asked, would you be at the Festival of Books?
yes,
And you will be. Yes.
yes, I will.
Yes. So 2 events in the West River.
Yeah.
Yes. So Festival of Books, I think, if I remember the dates correctly, September 22nd through 24th in Deadwood. And Nancy will be giving a presentation and a book signing.
Well, I would really like to say thank you to everyone for your interest in Wilder and for your interest in these books. And I hope you enjoy them. I look forward to meeting and talking to some of you through the years. I've enjoyed meeting everyone in the past, so I look forward to meeting more of you in the years to come.